Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. We are ready to go. We're going to be talking about sport as language and culture today. Get this started up here. There we go. All right, I do have my green shoes on in case you were worried. These ones even have green soles. How about that, huh? Slick. So, sport as language and culture. So this corresponds somewhat to, or does correspond quite a bit to the reading in the Gaming the World book about sport as part of sociology and part of different cultures. In the last session, we talked about social identity, right? And how our self-identity is composed primarily of two different components. Do you remember what those were? Well, one is your social identification, right? Or those social groups that you're affiliated with. That composes part of your self-identity. That plus the personal traits, right? Or your personal identity. So those two together formulate your self-identity. And along with that, you had your first discussion board, right? Which was similar to the 25-word assignment. But in this case, you had 100 words and you were writing your own obituary. So hopefully you didn't find that too morbid. But I think that you probably got the point of where when you're trying to describe yourself, those groups and those groups that mean a lot to you and values come through when you're describing yourself. So what is social identification? Well, it's our perception of belongingness and our perception of oneness with a particular group. How does the group become part, or our social affiliations become part of who we are, our own identity? And we also talked about some of the benefits to social identification, right? Those being self-esteem, being the transcending self for a broader life meaning than just our own personal existence. That sense of belonging, we use the example of if you move out of your current geographic area, how do you get a sense of belonging in that new area? A lot of times it's you're affiliating with a social group that you're already familiar with where you have shared values, and then that aspirational component which relates to the transcending self are the benefits. But let's not forget that we also talked about some drawbacks, right? There are some drawbacks to social identification. Sometimes people can become overly identified, where we formulate our in-groups around our own social identification, and then a lot of times those groups that we affiliate with have opposite groups, right? And that's where we start to get into rivalry, in-group, and then with our in-group comes these oppositional groups or these out-groups, and sometimes violence can be formed, can result from that, or sometimes it's bigotry or prejudice or our discrimination against those particular out-groups. And you see we've got a little fan here who seems to have some out-group hatred that he's probably modeling from a parent. All right, next. There we go. Sport as language. So let's look at a couple of examples here. I have a few videos that we will watch. And I want you to engage in an activity here. If you don't already have a piece of paper and a pencil in front of you, get out a piece of paper and pencil. Pause the video for a second while you get that ready. And as I play this video, I want you to go ahead and write down on the piece of paper any words, language that you hear that you don't recognize. Okay? So you're going to be listening, and I might, if I have to, I'll turn the volume up here. And you're going to write down any words that you don't recognize. We're going to be watching a cricket highlights of one of the biggest cricket rivalries in the world, India and Pakistan.
clipped away, and that will hurry away for 4. It's away, no one at deep mid-wicket.
And he gets the runs. This might run away to the boundary. This will fall short with it. Oh, has he taken it? If he has, it's a brilliant, brilliant catch. Pace again, it gets the top edge. It should be taken. I think it's curling in underneath it. In fact, it's Jadeja. This might be out. Taken comfortably. That's a good catch in the deep. Virat Kohli, the catcher. Oh, that looks like a big one. Yes, it is. Somebody will catch it in the crowd. There's another one. It's flatter, but once again, it's gone into the stands.
All gone. Yes. It's the Dhoni-Jadeja combination yet again. Up in the air. Fine leg, sets himself, should take the catch, does take the catch. Again, the full delivery. Oh, it's gone a long way up. This will take some catching, extra cover, mid-off. Has he taken it? Yes, he has. Oh, ball name, too quick for the left-hander, and he's played on. Oh. Got him again. Once again, the extra pace. Inside edge, onto the stumps. Catch it! Well, that's in the air, but might go beyond for 6. Long leg looked interested. Oh, he's in control of that. That is Yuvraj Singh at his imperious best. So in the deep, fielder in the deep, he will complete the catch. This is just the wicket that Pakistan needed. Someone turn the volume off at the Eden Gardens.
There's the 50 of Virat Kohli. Dhoni special. 1 run needed. There's the run. So many times with Dhoni hitting the winning runs in a crucial game. And we have the result of the India-Pakistan match. Virat Kohli 55 not out, and India won this by 6 wickets. He doesn't bowl as much as he used to.
All right, so that's probably the most cricket that you've ever watched in your life, unless you're perhaps one of our international students taking the course. So what did you write down? What words did you write down that you didn't understand? I know there were several in there that that I was not familiar with. They talked about away, something being away. They talked about the boundary. On a few of the catches, they talked about it being taken. The wicket itself, they talked about. So wicket seems to be like an out that we might think of in baseball, but it's also the actual physical, here's the physical wicket stand, whatever you would, I'm not sure what you would call it besides a wicket, but it's an actual physical thing, and then it also represents an out, I believe. The balls, the score, 18 with 5, I think is how you say that, and they were saying the target was 119, and you see that graphic there on the screen. And then you saw 2020. You saw on one of the graphics them talking about 2020, which is a specific type of cricket that's a shorter game and doesn't last days and days like the traditional cricket matches. So point being here, there's lots of language within the sport, even though the announcers were speaking English, of course. They were using lots of terms that we didn't necessarily recognize, at least those of us that are just familiar with American sports or traditionally American sports. So it's kind of like a language in that you have to learn the language of the sport to understand what the announcers are talking about for a match like that. Let's watch another example here that a lot of you might not be familiar with. This is from my particular favorite sport, Formula One racing, and we're going to watch a qualifying lap here from the most famous track or most famous Formula One event, which is Monaco.
The
indicator as to whether those Ferraris have already sealed the front of the grid.
Well, he's...
Oh, and same thing. Hopefully you got your pen or pencil and piece of paper. Write down any words that you might not be sure what they mean. So in that first few seconds, you heard him say the word grid. You know, some of you might not know what he's referring to, that announcer, when he says that word.
Always been quick in qualifying here as Jarno Trulli. You remember a few years ago he started on the front row of the grid in a Jordan. What he can do here in the Renault. It's been very nimble, very fast. We're riding on board with him. The best view in the house then as we enter the Casino Square. Hotel de Paris on our left. All the high rollers leaning out of their balconies. They're going to spend some money this weekend. 1/10 down already on Michael Schumacher, but it's always been the case with Trulli. His first sector is slower than Ferrari's. It's the second and third sectors where the Renault is blindingly fast. It could be on here, Martin.
He missed the sweet spot in the high mirror bow. He clumped the curb at Casino, at the hairpin rather, and they just cost you hundreds, but at the moment that was a little bit scruffy. But Trulli knows he's got to push for all he's worth if he's going to get in ahead of that Ferrari on the grid. We've got to go through 2 more corners yet before we know the second sector time. It's best part of 40 seconds, and it's coming up now, and he's up. And we know those Michelins hang on well. Trulli is up.
He is, as I said, second and third sectors where this Renault really flies. Is Jarno Trulli going to get ahead of Michael Schumacher? One more corner, plant the gas, dive for the line. Are you going to get Poland, Monaco away from Schumacher? You've taken it for the moment, Jarno. Can anyone take it from you? Rock and roll down to the Renault garage.
Excellent. The car just got better, the tyres got better, and really, truly putting it in the stunningly fast, and well, didn't it look under control too?
But wasn't it interesting the way that the lap got faster and faster, Martin? We've seen that with this car, haven't we? Alonso could do the same thing.
All right. So, same thing. What terms did you hear there? Perhaps chicane, which is actually the curb that you saw him driving over. In Monaco, they're red and white. The grid, which is the starting positions right before a race. So the grid is kind of the lineup. In Formula One, they have a standing start, meaning they get on the grid and start from a stop position. Qualifying is what we were watching, so that wasn't the actual race. Most of you probably picked up on it, but it was qualifying to see what spot you would be on the grid when the race started the next day. Hundredths, right? They said he was up by a few hundredths later in the lap, and in the early part of the lap he was down by a few hundredths. That's hundredths of a second. A tenth down, tenths of a second, right? Clip the corner, you saw him drive over a few of the corners. That's what that referred to, the sector. So each lap is divided up into 3 sectors of the course, and you get it. And then pole position, most of you probably are familiar with that, is the very first spot, or the number 1 spot on the grid itself. So perhaps there were a few terms that you didn't recognize. That's a language that is probably somewhat unfamiliar to perhaps not all of you, but most of you. Now let's look at a sport that we're very familiar with here in the US, and a highlight that could be hard to look at for anybody if you happen to be an Alabama fan. But I am not an Alabama fan, so I enjoy watching this highlight. The audio that's been dubbed over the video highlight of a play that many of you, I'm sure, have seen several times. But let's watch it again. And now I want you to kind of flip gears. So let's pretend that we're at a sports business class at a university in India or Pakistan or Monaco, right? And we don't watch American football, right? So let's watch this, and now I want you to write down, put yourself in that foreign position and write down words that you hear in the audio that if you were in India, you would most likely have no idea what that announcer is talking about, okay? All right. Oh, I just watched this yesterday. Hold on, I will pull it up. Let's escape out of here. And, oops, let's go here. All right, there we go, okay.
Well, I guess if this this thing comes up short, he can field it and run it out. All right, here we go. 56-yarder. No, does not have the leg. And Chris Davis takes it in the back of the end zone. He'll run it out to the 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 45. There goes Davis. Oh my God! Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game. He ran the missed field goal back. He ran it back 109 yards. They're not going to keep him off the field tonight. Holy cow! Oh my God! Auburn wins. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl in the most unbelievable fashion you will ever see. I cannot believe it. 34-28. And we thought a miracle in Jordan Hare was amazing. Oh my Lord in heaven. Chris Davis just read it. 109 yards. And Auburn is going to the championship game.
All right. Well, you see, we talked a little bit about religion as being something that people are affiliated with, and there you see that announcer crossing over sports and religion quite a bit. Thanking God for Chris Davis's run back. I think of course, I've seen that clip several times, and one of the most interesting things that I find is how the other announcer in the booth doesn't seem to be able to even say anything at all. He seems like he's having trouble breathing. So if you watch that again, see if you can hear the other announcer trying to breathe there. Sort of a funny clip there with the audio. But our purpose here, thinking about if we're in another country and we're watching American football, several words, I have some of them listed here, that people would probably have no idea what the announcer is referring to. A 56-yarder, of course, referring to the field goal, running it out of the end zone and trying to return it, the end zone itself. If you might have noticed him counting as Chris Davis was running past the yard markers, so he counts up to 50 and then he starts counting back down, which would certainly seem very strange if you didn't understand the American football field, and of course the Iron Bowl, the traditional name for that particular rivalry. So, point being here, that hopefully I've convinced you with these examples. Sport is like a language, like the authors talked about in the reading for today. It's a communicative form in that we're describing something, right? And we're communicating with other people about a certain topic or thing. There's clear rules with nuances to those rules. So the nuances in terms of the yard markers is just one example. There's some meaning behind it, right, that we're trying to articulate to others. It's a symbolic framework, right? There's symbolism to the language. And it's regionalized, right? We just proved that with our examples here. We were using sort of countries or nation examples, but most people in Western Europe would be able to watch that Formula One race, and even if they're not big Formula One fans, because it's such a popular sport, they would have no problem understanding exactly what those announcers were talking about. But here in North America, it's a little less popular, specifically the U.S. is pretty popular. But it's regionalized, right? Sports are, and their popularity and the language that goes along with sports. So let's think about, how do you learn that language, right? How did you learn to speak American football, if you will? More than likely, if you think about your own experience, I'm going to guess that there was some sort of familial influence. Somebody in your family, maybe parents, maybe an aunt or uncle, maybe a cousin, brother, sister, older brother or sister, that was interested in the sport and socialized you into that sport. Maybe it was a neighbor who was interested in the particular sport. Typically, it's some sort of socialization process. Sometimes the media can socialize you into something. For some of you, it could have been a video game, right? That taught you the language of a particular sport. Certainly, the rise of the FIFA video game has helped increase our fluency here in the U.S. in the language of soccer, particularly with your generation and those around your generation. So the authors of the reading talk about the reading that was in the Gaming the World book talk about hegemonic sports cultures. What does that term mean, hegemonic? You can think of it as meaning dominant, right? What's the dominant sports culture in a particular area? How about England? Any guesses as to what might be the hegemonic sports culture in England? When we think about dominant sports culture, I like to put it in an everyday example of where you could walk out of your house or walk out of the classroom into the hallway on campus, and other students might be in the hallway waiting to go to class. What are the sports that you could strike up a conversation about and be reasonably certain that they could converse with you back and forth, right? So in England, those sports would include Formula One. Certainly soccer would be included in that as well. Perhaps tennis, golf maybe to some degree as well. Rugby could be another one that would fit in the hegemonic sports culture in England. Korea, what do you think is a big part of their hegemonic sports culture or their dominant sports culture? Baseball, very popular in Korea. Soccer, perhaps, also maybe part of the hegemonic sports culture there. How about Norway? Well, when I think of Norway, I think of, boy, those skiers in the Olympics, you know, those not only downhill, but particularly cross-country skiers. It seems like every time I watch the biathlon in the Olympics, it's always several Norwegian athletes competing against each other to see who's going to get the gold. And actually, the biathlon reminds me, I always wonder how that sport became an Olympic sport. You know, they take the cross-country skiing and they combine it with rifle. I'm thinking that it had to be somebody, probably a Norwegian. You could probably Google it and figure it out. But that was a really good cross-country skier, but just not good enough to make the Olympics. Was probably a pretty good marksman with a rifle, but just not quite good enough to make the rifle team. They had a lot of influence, and they said, you know what, let's combine cross-country skiing and rifle, seemingly unrelated, into a sport, and I'm probably going to be at the elite level. I've run several marathons myself, but I'm certainly not world class or anything close to it. But I wonder if you did maybe statistical research analysis combined with running marathons, maybe I could be an Olympic athlete. So that's sort of my idea there. All right, so moving on. Peru. I got a chance to visit Peru several years ago, and I met with a sports business professor there, a sport management professor, and I asked him this question of, beyond the obvious choice, which most of you probably have in your mind as to what sport is in the hegemonic sports culture, being soccer. That's true, they do have a professional soccer league that is the most dominant sport. And I said, beyond soccer, what's the second most popular sport? And he said, well, we don't have any other sports leagues that are completely professional, only soccer. But the second most professional, a semi-professional league, is actually volleyball in the sport of Peru. Australia, the most popular sport in Australia is not soccer, not cricket even, depending on where you are in Australia. Their sports culture is somewhat regionalized. Australian rules football, very popular in the Melbourne area, the southern, let's see, it would be southeastern portion of Australia. I was also fortunate to be able to visit Australia a few years ago. And as you move further north in Australia, rugby becomes more popular. There's rugby union and rugby league, two different versions of rugby. We might look at Australian rules football and think of it as rugby, but it's not the same. It's a related sport, another code of football, but not the same as rugby. But Australian rules football is the most popular in the Melbourne area. Ecuador, any guesses there? Soccer as well, probably. How about in the U.S.? What's our hegemonic sports culture? Well, you've probably already thought about this as I was going through the list. Here in the U.S., we've got a lot of sports in our hegemonic sports culture, right? Certainly American football, basketball, baseball, soccer, hockey are kind of our big four. Soccer, maybe with the growth of MLS and the growth of the international soccer popularity, maybe knocking on the door there. Depending on where you are in the country, if you're in the Southeast, maybe NASCAR fits into that kind of definition of being hegemonic, where you can go and just talk to people on the sidewalk or in the hallways at work or school about it. So we've got a pretty crowded hegemonic sports space, a little bit like England, right? Where we have several sports that maybe fit into that, fully professional leagues, even beyond those sports that I just mentioned we have. So how is our sport language distinct? Well, one thing that makes us distinct is that we get these multi-sport performers. This doesn't happen in other countries around the world much. One of the most popular ones of all time, Bo Jackson. Here's his Nike commercial that celebrates his multi-sport ability.
Don't I know you? Nice shoes. Kansas City one. You sure we haven't met before? Now where's that Tour de France thing? Nice shoes. I knew I should have taken the right turn at Albuquerque. Have you ever been to LA? Oh, don't surf. That's what you think, dude. Might you all join me in a spot of tea? Where'd you play your college ball? What is he doing here?
I thought this was another Bono's commercial.
Has anyone seen Bo's ball? I know, Kansas City. Nice shoes. Nice shoes. You ever play with Bo Diddley?
All right, so obviously that commercial, a Nike commercial celebrating Bo Jackson's incredible ability in multiple sports. So why is that distinct to the U.S. so much? Well, it ties into another aspect that's distinct to our sport language, and that's college sports and the number of college sports at such an elite level that allows our athletes to come up through the ranks, have great training and coaching all the way through in multiple sports, right? And they don't really even have to choose usually down to one sport until they get to kind of the Division I athlete level. And then there's certain athletes such as Bo Jackson, obviously he's from before most of your time, but where he can play at that elite level in both sports, right? He went to college at Auburn, won the Heisman Trophy in football, was one of the best baseball players in the country at Auburn, and then gets drafted into both sports and plays both sports for several years. Of course, Deion Sanders being who followed in Bo's footsteps immediately, and we've had a few other athletes since then that have tended not necessarily to play at the level that Bo Jackson and Deion played at, some that have played minor league baseball and then become professional athletes in either football or basketball. But it's that college sports system that's also unique to our sports culture that allows for that to happen more than in other parts of the country. Motorsport, I already mentioned. Formula One is the highest level of motorsports, very popular around the world, but here NASCAR, for the most part, dominates our motorsports culture. We started Halls of Fame, where we celebrated these athletes and their legacy. Now other countries have since adapted that, having Hall of Fames for their particular athletes. And teams as businesses. So this is an important aspect, considering that this is a sports business class. We're the ones that kind of pioneered that here in the U.S. In most of the rest of the world, teams were more like clubs that people could belong to. You belonged to the club, and there were lower level teams within the club that you might play on, rec teams, and as you got better, you could move up as well into more competitive clubs, and of course at the very top was the elite level club that competed with other clubs, and then eventually got professionalized over time. So these were sports clubs that were tied to a community. But ours have always been not really clubs, but franchises, right? And the franchises are businesses that are owned by a single owner in most cases. And that owner, if his business, his franchise isn't doing well in one particular city, he can move the franchise to another city, right? But in other parts of the world, their social clubs or their sports clubs, they're tied into the community. Hardly ever do you see one of these clubs move to another location. That's completely antithetical to their conception of sports clubs. And only recently have they started to adopt our conceptualization of clubs being owned, put on stock exchanges in some cases where you have shareholders in the club, and then if a single person buys up enough shares, they become the majority shareholder, then they're the owner, like we typically think of owners, and have that controlling interest over the organization and can run it like a business for revenue purposes. Some other quick examples of our distinction as it relates to some different terms. So in English, you have one term relating to sports, and in US English, you have a different term. So when the English say nil, they're really saying zero, right, in terms of a score. When they say pitch, they're talking about the field. When they say a fixture, we talk about it as being a game, right? The keeper, most of you know, is the goalie. If things are all level in a score, it means it's tied or it's even. The bowler in English is what we would think of as the pitcher. And a kit in traditional English is what we think of as a jersey, right? So just a few more examples there. The spread of sports around the world, right? That's going to be an ongoing topic in our course. So the U.S. has been somewhat resistant traditionally. We like sports that were founded here or we conceive as being founded here in the U.S. But that's resistance has started to break down as satellite television has become more ubiquitous, right? And streaming games has become much easier as internet connections have gotten so much better. It makes it possible to stream sports from other parts of the world. And so we started to see some of those barriers come down, and we'll get into that in our future session here. Where do we see overlapping sports cultures, though? One major overlapping sports culture is between England and Australia. Why do you think that is? Well, if you know your history, England or Australia used to be part of the English Empire, right? Australia was originally started as a prison, a geographic kind of prison, sort of like we have Alcatraz, only much more extreme in terms of distance, where the English sent all their worst prisoners to Australia to get them out of England. So it started as a penal colony for the English Empire. So how does sport span borders? Well, imperialism, English imperialism, has been one example of how the sport of soccer, cricket, rugby spread around the world. It spread with the English Empire. But there's many other ways. Migration and colonialism kind of tend to go together, but migration also happens for other reasons, traditionally because a food source moved, but it could be because of weather patterns. Now we've seen quite a migration here in the U.S. from northern areas to southern areas as air conditioning became more widespread in the 50s and 60s. And then it became much easier to live in the South in the summer because you had air conditioning inside of buildings. And so you've seen that migration happen, and that's happened also on a global scale. Travel, right? As travel becomes easier, that's how sport spans borders. You go and you travel somewhere and you watch their sport for a little bit, and you can sometimes pick up interest in it. Media proliferation is certainly the biggest factor, the modern biggest factor. Traditionally it was colonialism, but now it's that media proliferation. As I mentioned earlier, we have global media now. It's pretty easy for me to follow Formula One even though I'm in the US most of the time. I can follow the races no matter where they happen across the globe, and I can watch them in real time because of our global media and our satellite streaming internet media availability. So what qualities are necessary for sport to spread around the world? Well, first of all, we need leisure time, right? And for a while, for a long period of history, our economy was a subsistence economy, meaning that we spent all of our time hunting, gathering, taking care of kids, just trying to stay alive, to subsist. And then the Industrial Revolution happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and all of a sudden, parts of the world that were on the front end of the Industrial Revolution, being England and then shortly followed by the US, we were able to produce more than we could consume, which meant we could sell our goods to other people around the world. We could produce more than we needed in a shorter period of time, which gave us some leisure time and also gave us some leisure income. Not leisure income, gave us some discretionary, that's the word I was looking for, some discretionary income and some discretionary time, some of which we could spend on leisure, right? We could spend playing sports or watching people, the best at the sport, play sports. We could spend money to go and watch those people, right? And that's why you see the rise of professional sports happen in coinciding with the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of sports leagues, the earliest sports professional leagues, came up in the late 1800s, early 1900s. English professional soccer, Major League Baseball in the U.S. Here in the Metro Cincinnati area, of course, the Reds are famous for being the first professional baseball team. I think their first year of operation was 1869, right at when the Industrial Revolution was taking off, because it made it possible for there to be a professional team that could be supported by people coming out to watch them, because enough people had that discretionary income to spend on something like that. Interaction and exposure, that's necessary for sports to spread, right? Codified games. The games have to be codified. And what do we mean by codified? We mean a certain set of rules that everybody agrees upon, right? If the U.S. team is going to play England in tennis, let's say, which is a rivalry that we're going to study in our next session, both sides have to agree on the rules that the game is going to be played by. So the games have to be codified in a way that opponents can agree on how they're going to interact and play the game, and the competition is going to run. And of course, we need sporting space, right? It's a lot harder to produce a motorsports competition because the sporting space needed is so expansive compared to a basketball game, right? Where you don't need that much space. Or a soccer match, right? Yes, a soccer field's bigger than a basketball court, but all you need, you can play soccer on a much smaller space, right? And a lot of you probably have played indoor soccer, for example, or as a kid when you played soccer, you didn't maybe, depending on where you lived, have the space for a big field if you lived in an urban area, so you play in a smaller space, right? But some sort of sporting space is necessary as well. This video is the top 10 global sporting events. I'm not going to bother to look at it now, but you can click through it in the slides posted on our course website, and you can click into that and watch that if that's something that you'd like to see a video about the top 10 global sporting events. All right, so last thing here on this session, the authors talk about globalization. They talk about a first globalization and a second globalization. The first globalization they talk about is the Industrial Revolution, right? And how that created a more globalized world because products were being produced that could be sold around the world. The second globalization is the digital revolution, right? Now, traders don't have to get onto ships and go to other parts of the world to trade goods. Some goods that are intangible, like sports, you can spread around the world through the digital revolution. So we have the industrial being that first, and that post-industrial or digital revolution being the second globalization. How has globalization changed in the digital age? Well, media proliferation, right? We've already talked about that. Enhanced migration and mobility means it's, airplane travel is accessible to many more people than it used to be. And of course, 100 years ago, it wasn't even really possible to travel by airplane. The traditional industrial working class, right, has been affected by this globalization. The movement of jobs to different parts of the world has changed where there is middle class and where there is money to be spent on professional sports and spectator sports. We've also had the rise of global institutions. So FIFA is a good example of this as a global institution that's governing the sport all around the world, right? The digital age has made that much easier for FIFA to operate and control the sport in different parts of the world. And then the authors talk about the relationship between globalized sport and cosmopolitanism. So when you think about cosmopolitanism, what do you think of? You probably think of big cities, right? Cosmopolitan areas. And the word cosmopolitanism just means differences between groups all in one place and respect for those differences, right? And we equate cosmopolitanism to big cities because you get people from many different backgrounds in a confined space. They interact with each other And for the most part, although of course we have exceptions, they respect each other's different backgrounds, right? That's cosmopolitanism. You're interacting with others different from yourself, and in that interaction, what happens is you gain a respect for that other person as being a person just like you in many ways, but also with some differences as well. So does globalized sport contribute to some cosmopolitanism, some understanding of different cultures? Certainly. Does cosmopolitanism contribute to globalized sport? Probably it works in that direction as well. So hopefully this sort of summary and discussion helped you understand that first reading, and that's it for now.